The telegram from the widow Ortiz arrived on a Tuesday morning in March of 1878, and Thomas Lawson knew, before opening it, that his entire life was about to change. He stood in the doorway of his weathered ranch house, the envelope trembling slightly in his calloused hands. The winter had been brutal in Abilene, Kansas, and his cattle herd had dwindled from 43 head to just 18. The bank in town had sent 2 notices already, each one more threatening than the last. Thomas was 26 years old, and he was staring down the barrel of complete ruin. His father had built this ranch from nothing, carving it out of the harsh prairie with determination and sweat. When cholera took both his parents 3 years ago, Thomas had sworn on their graves that he would keep the land in the family. But swearing and doing were 2 different things entirely, and the prairie had a way of humbling even the most determined men. Thomas tore open the telegram with rough fingers. The message was brief, written in the clipped language of necessity. Niece needs marriage. Good worker. Cannot speak. Arrives Thursday. Maria Ortiz. He read it 3 times, his heart sinking with each pass. The widow Ortiz ran a boarding house in town, and Thomas had mentioned his dire circumstances to her 2 weeks ago in a moment of weakness. He had not expected this response. A mail-order bride arrangement was common enough in these parts, but a woman who could not speak presented complications he had not anticipated. Still, what choice did he have? The bank would foreclose by summer if he could not prove he had helped to run the ranch. A wife, even one who could not speak, would be better than losing everything his father had built. Thomas walked to his small desk and pulled out a piece of paper. His handwriting was crude but legible as he penned his response. "Will meet Thursday train. Thomas Lawson." Thursday arrived with a dust storm that turned the sky the color of burnt copper. Thomas dressed in his only good shirt, a blue cotton thing his mother had sewn years ago, and rode into Abilene on his bay mare. The town was bustling despite the weather, with cowboys and farmers crowding the wooden sidewalks, seeking refuge in saloons and general stores. The train station sat at the eastern edge of town, a modest building with a covered platform. Thomas tied his horse and waited, his stomach churning with anxiety. He had no idea what to expect. The widow Ortiz had provided no description, no details beyond the stark facts. The woman was her niece, she could work, and she could not speak. The train arrived 30 minutes late, wheezing into the station with a great hiss of steam and screech of brakes. Thomas watched passengers disembark, a family of homesteaders with frightened eyes, 2 businessmen in city suits, a traveling salesman with cases of goods. Then he saw her. She was small, perhaps 5 feet and 3 inches, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun beneath a plain gray bonnet. Her dress was simple brown calico, patched but clean. She carried a single carpet bag and moved with careful, measured steps. Her face was difficult to see beneath the bonnet, but Thomas caught a glimpse of olive skin and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The widow Ortiz was with her, a stout woman with silver hair and a commanding presence. She spotted Thomas immediately and waved him over. "Thomas Lawson," she said, her Spanish accent thick but her English clear. "This is my niece, Grace Ortiz. She arrived from New Mexico Territory last week." Grace looked up at Thomas then, and he found himself staring into the most expressive eyes he had ever seen. They were dark brown, almost black, and filled with an intelligence that took him off guard. She studied him with the same careful attention she had given the town, and he felt suddenly self-conscious about his worn boots and sun-weathered face. "Hello," Thomas said, then felt foolish. If she could not speak, what was the point of verbal greeting? But Grace surprised him. She set down her carpet bag and extended her hand in a firm, businesslike manner. Thomas shook it, noting the calluses on her palm. These were working hands, not the soft fingers of a city woman. The widow Ortiz continued, "Grace understands everything you say. She can hear perfectly well. She simply cannot speak. An illness when she was a child damaged her voice. But she can write, and she is an excellent worker. She knows cattle and horses, and she can cook and manage a household." Thomas nodded, still feeling overwhelmed by the reality of the situation. I appreciate you coming all this way, Miss Ortiz. I know this is not. Well, it is not a normal arrangement." Grace reached into her dress pocket and produced a small slate and piece of chalk. She wrote quickly, her handwriting neat and precise. "I understand the circumstances. You need help, I need a home. It is practical." There was no romance in those words, no pretense of affection. Thomas found that oddly reassuring. At least they were being honest with each other. "The wedding is arranged for tomorrow morning," the widow Ortiz said. "I've taken the liberty of speaking with Pastor Reynolds. He will perform the ceremony at the church at 10 o'clock. Grace will stay with me tonight at the boarding house." Everything was moving so fast. Thomas felt like he was being swept along by a flash flood, unable to stop or even slow the current. But he nodded, because what else could he do? "Tomorrow morning, then," he agreed. Grace wrote on her slate again. "May I see the ranch first?" Thomas blinked in surprise. "You want to see it before the wedding?" She nodded firmly, underlining her question with the chalk. The widow Ortiz looked uncertain. "Grace, there is not much time. We must prepare." But Grace shook her head and wrote again. "I should know what I am agreeing to." Thomas found himself admiring her practical nature. She was not being swayed by sentiment or rushed into anything blindly. "I can take you out there now if you like. It is about an hour's ride." The widow Ortiz sighed but nodded. "Very well, I will accompany you as chaperone." They rented a wagon from the livery stable, and Thomas drove them out to the ranch. The dust storm had subsided, leaving the air crystal clear and the sky a brilliant blue. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, dotted with patches of new spring grass. In the distance, his small herd of cattle grazed near a creek. Grace sat between Thomas and her aunt on the wagon seat, her eyes fixed on the landscape. Thomas found himself stealing glances at her, trying to gauge her reaction. Did she find it beautiful, desolate, terrifying? When they reached the ranch house, Thomas helped both women down from the wagon. The house was small, just 3 rooms, a main living area with a kitchen, a bedroom, and a small storage room. The barn was in better condition than the house, a testament to his father's priorities. A chicken coop sat empty. Thomas had sold the chickens 2 months ago. Grace walked through the house slowly, examining everything. She ran her fingers along the rough wooden walls, tested the pump at the kitchen sink, inspected the cast iron stove. In the bedroom, she paused at the sight of the single bed with its patchwork quilt. Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. He had not thought about the sleeping arrangements until that moment. "I can make a bedroll on the floor," he said quickly, "until you are comfortable with other arrangements." Grace turned to look at him, and something flickered in her dark eyes. Gratitude, perhaps? She nodded and wrote on her slate, "That is kind." Outside, she walked to the barn and inspected the 2 horses, his bay mare and an aging gelding. She checked their hooves, their teeth, ran her hands along their legs. Thomas watched, impressed. She clearly knew her way around livestock. Finally, Grace walked to the edge of the small bluff where the house sat and looked out over the prairie. The wind caught the edges of her bonnet, and she reached up to remove it, revealing her face fully for the first time. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were too strong, her chin too determined, her mouth too wide. But there was something compelling about her face, something that made Thomas unable to look away. She stood there for a long moment, and Thomas thought he saw her shoulders relax slightly, as if she had been carrying a great tension and was finally allowing herself to release it. When she returned to where Thomas and the widow Ortiz waited, she wrote on her slate, "It will do." The wedding took place the next morning as planned. The church was small and nearly empty, with only the widow Ortiz and 2 other boarders as witnesses. Pastor Reynolds was an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle voice. He seemed unsure about the arrangement but performed the ceremony without comment. Grace wore a simple dress of dark blue that the widow Ortiz had provided. Thomas wore his cleanest clothes and had even managed to shave and trim his dark blonde hair. They stood before the altar, 2 strangers bound together by necessity, when Pastor Reynolds asked if Thomas would take Grace as his lawfully wedded wife. He answered in a clear, steady voice, "I will." When the pastor turned to Grace, there was an awkward pause. Grace nodded solemnly, then took her slate and wrote, "I will." Pastor Reynolds read it aloud, blessed them both, and pronounced them husband and wife. "You may kiss your bride," he said to Thomas. Thomas hesitated, looking at Grace uncertainly. She met his gaze steadily, then offered her cheek. He pressed a brief, chaste kiss to her cheek, his lips barely grazing her skin, and just like that they were married. They rode back to the ranch in the wagon, Grace's few belongings loaded in the back. The widow Ortiz had said her goodbyes with tears in her eyes and whispered instructions in Spanish to Grace. Thomas caught enough of it to understand she was telling her niece to be brave and to write if she needed anything. The ride was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. Thomas found himself wanting to fill the silence with words but resisted the urge. Grace sat beside him, watching the prairie roll past, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When they arrived at the ranch, Thomas helped her carry her things inside. She had brought remarkably little: 2 changes of clothes, some personal items, a Bible, and a leather-bound journal. "You can put your things in the bedroom," Thomas said. "I will sleep out here for now." Grace shook her head and reached for her slate. "The bedroom is for both of us eventually. I understand how marriage works, but I appreciate your patience." Her directness caught him off guard. Thomas nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Right. Well, I should show you around properly then, show you where everything is." He took her through the property, explaining the layout, the work that needed doing, the plans he had for rebuilding the herd. Grace listened attentively, occasionally writing questions on her slate. Her questions were intelligent and practical, focused on water sources, grazing rotation, and breeding schedules. By the time evening fell, Thomas was exhausted and oddly grateful for Grace's presence. She had already made herself useful, preparing a simple supper of beans and cornbread, using the supplies in his sparse pantry. They ate in silence at the small wooden table, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin plates and the distant lowing of cattle. After supper, Grace washed the dishes while Thomas brought in his bedroll and laid it out on the floor near the stove. The spring nights were still cold and he would need the warmth. Grace watched him, then wrote on her slate, "Are you sure? I can sleep out here." "You are my wife," Thomas said firmly. "You will sleep in the bed." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. She retired to the bedroom, closing the door behind her. Thomas lay awake for a long time, staring at the rough wooden ceiling. He could hear small sounds from the bedroom: the rustle of fabric, the creak of bed springs, a soft sigh. He wondered what she was thinking, this woman who had agreed to marry a stranger and move to an isolated ranch in the middle of nowhere. He wondered if she was afraid. He wondered if she regretted her decision. Most of all, he wondered how they would make this strange arrangement work. The first weeks of their marriage fell into a rhythm born of necessity. Thomas would wake before dawn and head out to tend the cattle and horses. Grace would rise shortly after and prepare breakfast. They would eat together in companionable silence. Then Grace would tackle the endless work of managing the household while Thomas worked the land. Thomas was impressed by Grace's capabilities. She was not exaggerating when she said she could work. She attacked every task with determination and efficiency. She cleaned the house thoroughly, organized the storage room, planted a vegetable garden near the house, and even managed to repair the fence around the chicken coop in preparation for getting new birds. In the evenings, they would eat supper together, and sometimes Grace would show Thomas what she had accomplished during the day. She took pride in her work, he could see that, and he made sure to acknowledge her efforts. "The garden looks good," he would say, or "Thank you for mending my shirt." She would nod, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Communication between them developed its own language. Grace carried her slate everywhere, but increasingly she found other ways to express herself. A raised eyebrow, a tilt of her head, a gesture of her hand. Thomas learned to read these signals, to understand what she needed or wanted without words. One evening, about 3 weeks into their marriage, Thomas came in from the barn to find Grace at the kitchen table with her journal open. She was writing intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she noticed him, she quickly closed the book. "I am sorry," Thomas said. "I did not mean to disturb you." She shook her head and opened her slate instead. "You did not disturb me. I was just writing my thoughts." "It must be hard," Thomas said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Not being able to speak, I mean, having to write everything down." Grace looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her dark eyes. Then she wrote, "I have been this way since I was 7. I am used to it. Sometimes it is lonely, but sometimes silence is better than words." Thomas sat down across from her. "What happened? If you do not mind me asking." Grace hesitated, then began writing on her slate, erasing and rewriting as she went. "Scarlet fever. It nearly killed me. When I recovered, my voice was gone. The doctor said the illness damaged something in my throat. I can make sounds, but not words." "I am sorry," Thomas said quietly. She shrugged, a gesture that seemed to say it was simply the way things were. Then she wrote, "Tell me about your parents. About this ranch." So Thomas did. He told her about his father, a stern but fair man who had come to Kansas after the war with nothing but determination and a dream. About his mother, who had been beautiful and kind and had made this rough house feel like a home. About how they had built the ranch together, survived droughts and harsh winters and the daily struggles of frontier life. "They would have liked you," Thomas said when he finished. "My mother would have appreciated how hard you work. My father would have respected your practical nature." Grace smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. She wrote, "I wish I could have met them." That night, as Thomas lay on his bedroll, he realized something had shifted between them. They were not just two strangers bound by necessity anymore. They were beginning to know each other, to understand each other. It was not love, not yet, but it was something. A foundation, perhaps, on which something stronger could be built. April brought warmer weather and new challenges. Thomas managed to buy 6 more head of cattle from a neighboring rancher, stretching his meager resources to their limit. He and Grace worked together to move the new animals to the ranch, and Thomas was impressed by her skill with horses and her fearlessness around the large cattle. One afternoon, as they were moving the cattle through a narrow gully, one of the steers panicked and charged toward Grace. Thomas shouted a warning, his heart leaping into his throat, but Grace was already moving. She swung her rope with practiced ease, catching the steer and redirecting its momentum away from her. The animal stumbled but calmed, and crisis was averted. Thomas rode up to her, his hands shaking with residual fear. "Are you all right?" Grace nodded, perfectly calm, and gestured that she was fine. "You could have been hurt," Thomas said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Killed, even." Grace pulled out her slate and wrote, "But I was not. I know what I am doing." "I know, but—" Thomas trailed off, surprised by the intensity of his own reaction. When had he started caring so much about her safety? That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the prairie, Thomas found himself watching Grace instead of the sky. She had removed her bonnet, and the fading light caught in her dark hair, turning it almost copper where the sun touched it. Her profile was strong and serene, and Thomas felt something stir in his chest that he had not felt in a long time. Affection. More than affection. The beginnings of something deeper. "Grace," he said softly. She turned to look at him, her eyebrows raised in question. Thomas hesitated, unsure how to articulate what he was feeling. "I want you to know. I am glad you came here. I am glad you agreed to marry me." Grace's expression softened. She reached for her slate and wrote, "I am glad too." They sat there together as darkness fell, neither one wanting to break the comfortable silence between them. In early May, a spring storm rolled across the prairie with frightening speed. Thomas and Grace had been out checking the herd when the sky suddenly turned green and the wind picked up with unnatural force. Thomas knew immediately what was coming. "We need to get to shelter," he shouted over the rising wind. "Now." They rode hard for the ranch house, the wind whipping around them and the first fat drops of rain beginning to fall. Behind them, Thomas could hear the ominous roar that meant a twister was forming. His blood ran cold. They reached the house, and Thomas practically dragged Grace off her horse. "The cellar. We need to get to the cellar." The small storm cellar was dug into the hillside behind the house, a cramped space meant for storing preserves and providing shelter from exactly this kind of weather. Thomas yanked open the heavy door and pushed Grace inside, following close behind and pulling the door shut just as the storm hit with full fury. The cellar was dark and damp, barely large enough for two people. Thomas fumbled for the lantern he kept on a shelf and managed to light it with trembling hands. The flickering light revealed Grace pressed against the far wall, her eyes wide but her expression controlled. Above them, the storm raged with terrifying violence. The wind screamed like a living thing, and they could hear debris hitting the cellar door. Thomas prayed the door would hold, prayed the house would survive, prayed they would not be buried alive. Grace suddenly moved closer to him, and Thomas instinctively put his arm around her. She did not pull away. Instead, she pressed against him, seeking comfort in the face of nature's fury. Thomas held her, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his chest. The storm lasted for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. When the roaring finally subsided, leaving only the steady drum of rain, Thomas and Grace remained huddled together, neither one willing to break the contact just yet. Finally, Thomas stirred. "I think it has passed. I should check the damage." Grace nodded but kept her hand on his arm as he stood, as if to steady herself. Thomas pushed open the cellar door carefully, ready to pull it shut again if the storm returned. The world outside was transformed. The rain was still falling but gently now. The house was still standing, though part of the roof had been torn away. The barn had fared better, appearing mostly intact. In the distance, Thomas could see the dark funnel of the tornado moving away across the prairie. Grace emerged from the cellar and stood beside him, surveying the damage. Then she did something unexpected. She turned to him and placed both hands on his chest, looking up at him with intense emotion in her eyes. Her mouth opened, and Thomas heard her make a sound, a wordless vocalization that nevertheless conveyed everything she was feeling: fear, relief, gratitude. Without thinking, Thomas pulled her into a tight embrace. "We are safe," he murmured into her hair. "We are both safe." She nodded against his chest, her hands clutching the fabric of his shirt. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the rain. The next several days were spent repairing the damage from the storm. Thomas worked to patch the roof while Grace salvaged what she could from inside the house. Several of their supplies had been ruined by rain, and part of her vegetable garden had been destroyed. But overall, they had been fortunate. Neighbors from the surrounding ranches came by to offer help, as was the custom. Thomas was grateful for the assistance, though he noticed how the other men looked at Grace with curiosity and sometimes pity. Word had spread that Thomas Lawson had married a mute woman, and the frontier community did not quite know what to make of it. Grace handled the attention with quiet dignity. She communicated using her slate when necessary, but mostly stayed busy with work, not giving anyone cause to question her capabilities. Thomas found himself growing protective of her, quick to deflect intrusive questions or comments. One evening, after the last of the neighbors had left, Grace prepared supper and they ate on the repaired porch, enjoying the cool evening air. Thomas noticed Grace seemed pensive, her eyes distant. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Grace pulled out her slate and wrote for a long time before showing him. "In New Mexico, before I came here, people treated me like I was simple-minded. They spoke slowly, as if I could not understand. They made decisions for me. My aunt was kind, but even she sometimes forgot that I can think for myself. Here, you treat me like a person, like an equal. I want to thank you for that." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. "You are my wife, my partner. Of course I treat you as an equal." Grace smiled and wrote, "Not all men would." "Then they are fools," Thomas said firmly. That night, Thomas lay on his bedroll as usual, but sleep would not come. He kept thinking about Grace, about the softness of her hair when he had held her during the storm, about the way her eyes lit up when she smiled, about the quiet strength she brought to every task. He had married her for survival, but somewhere along the way, his feelings had changed. He cared for her, more than cared. He was falling in love with her. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. What if she did not feel the same way? Their marriage was a practical arrangement. She had never given any indication that she wanted more than that. But then he remembered the way she had pressed against him in the storm cellar, the way she looked at him sometimes when she thought he was not watching, the small touches that had become more frequent, her hand on his arm, her shoulder brushing his as they worked side by side. Maybe, just maybe, her feelings were changing too. In mid-May, Thomas had to make a trip to Abilene for supplies. It would be an all-day journey, leaving before dawn and returning after dark. He considered asking Grace to come with him but decided against it. The ranch needed tending and he could move faster alone. "I will be back tonight," he told Grace over breakfast. "Bar the door while I am gone. Do not open it for anyone you do not know." Grace nodded and wrote on her slate, "I know how to use the rifle." Thomas smiled. "I know you do. But hopefully you will not need it." He rode off as the sun rose, glancing back once to see Grace standing in the doorway, watching him go. Something in his chest tightened at the sight. He did not like leaving her alone. The day in Abilene was productive. Thomas settled some accounts, bought necessary supplies, and even managed to negotiate a small extension on his bank loan. The banker had been impressed by Thomas's progress, particularly the fact that he now had a wife to help run the ranch. "Marriage is good for a man," the banker had said, adjusting his spectacles. "Especially out here. A good woman can make all the difference." "She is a good woman," Thomas had agreed, feeling a surge of pride. On the ride home, as the sun began to set, Thomas stopped at the general store one more time. He had seen something in the window that morning and he could not get it out of his mind. It was frivolous, an unnecessary expense, but he wanted to do it anyway. He bought a small music box, inlaid with mother-of-pearl and decorated with tiny painted flowers. When you wound the key, it played a gentle melody. Thomas had no idea if Grace liked music, but something about the delicate beauty of the object reminded him of her. Seemingly simple on the surface, but filled with hidden complexity. He arrived home well after dark, tired and dusty from the long ride. As he approached the house, he was relieved to see lamplight in the windows. Grace would have heard his horse and would know it was him. Sure enough, the door opened before he could knock, and Grace stood there with the rifle in her hands, lowered but ready. When she saw it was him, her face broke into a smile of genuine relief and happiness. Thomas felt his heart stutter. Had she worried about him? Missed him? "I am home," he said unnecessarily. Grace set the rifle aside and helped him carry in the supplies. Thomas unsaddled his horse and got the animal settled before coming back inside. Grace had prepared supper and had it waiting for him, along with hot coffee. They ate, and Thomas told her about his day in town, about the banker's approval and the supplies he had purchased. Grace listened, her eyes fixed on his face, and Thomas realized how much he had missed her presence during the long day. After supper, Thomas remembered the music box. He felt suddenly self-conscious about the gift. What if she thought it was silly? What if she did not like it? I bought something for you," he said, pulling the wrapped package from his saddlebag. "It is not much, but I thought you might like it." Grace took the package with curious eyes. She unwrapped it carefully, preserving the paper, and gasped when she saw the music box. She looked up at Thomas with wonder in her eyes, then back at the box. Thomas reached over and wound the key. The gentle melody filled the small house, sweet and melancholy. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She set the music box down carefully and reached for her slate with shaking hands. "It is beautiful. No one has ever given me something so beautiful. Thank you." "You are welcome," Thomas said softly. "You have worked so hard. You deserve something nice." Grace set down her slate and stood. She crossed the small distance between them, and for the first time, she initiated an embrace. She wrapped her arms around Thomas's waist and pressed her face against his chest. Thomas held her, his heart pounding. "Grace," he whispered. She looked up at him, tears still glistening in her eyes, and in that moment, Thomas knew he could not wait any longer. He cupped her face gently in his hands and lowered his head slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She did not pull away. Their lips met softly, tentatively. It was not a passionate kiss, but rather one of tenderness and promise. When they parted, Grace was smiling through her tears. She picked up her slate and wrote, "I should tell you something." Thomas waited, his heart still racing. Grace wrote carefully, "When I agreed to marry you, it was practical. I needed a home, you needed help. But these past weeks, working beside you, learning who you are, my feelings have changed. I care for you. I am grateful this arrangement brought me here." "My feelings have changed too," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "I care for you, Grace, more than I thought possible in such a short time." Grace wrote again. "What do we do now?" Thomas smiled. "We build a life together, a real marriage, if that is what you want." Grace nodded emphatically, then wrote, "Yes, that is what I want." That night, for the first time, Thomas did not sleep on the floor. Grace took his hand and led him to the bedroom, and though they were both nervous and uncertain, they came together with tenderness and growing passion. It was not perfect. Nothing ever is the first time. But it was real and honest, and when Thomas woke the next morning with Grace asleep in his arms, he felt happier than he had in years. The ranch flourished through the summer. With two people working together, tasks that had once seemed impossible became manageable. The herd grew, the garden produced abundantly, and Thomas even managed to buy a small flock of chickens. Grace threw herself into making the house a home. She sewed curtains for the windows, braided rugs for the floor, and filled the rooms with small touches that made the space warmer and more welcoming. The music box sat on a shelf in the bedroom, and sometimes in the evenings, Thomas would wind it up, and they would lie in bed listening to its sweet melody. Their communication continued to evolve. Thomas became so attuned to Grace's non-verbal cues that she often did not need her slate at all. A look, a gesture, a touch of her hand was enough to convey what she meant. They developed their own private language, intimate and unique to them. In late June, the widow Ortiz came to visit, bringing supplies from town and news of the wider world. She was delighted to see how well Grace and Thomas were doing, how comfortable they had become with each other. "I can see you are happy," the widow told Grace in Spanish, which Thomas was slowly learning to understand. "You have made a good life here." Grace nodded and wrote on her slate in Spanish, "He is a good man, better than I hoped for." The widow smiled and patted Grace's hand. "I am glad, my child. You deserve happiness." That evening, after the widow had left, Thomas and Grace sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. The prairie was alive with the sounds of summer. Crickets chirping, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft lowing of cattle settling for the night. Grace leaned against Thomas, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. He thought about how far they had come since that awkward meeting at the train station just a few months ago. Two strangers thrown together by circumstance, now bound by something much stronger. "I love you," Thomas said quietly, the words coming easily now. "I should have said it before." "I love you, Grace." Grace sat up and looked at him, her eyes shining in the starlight. She opened her mouth, and Thomas heard her make that wordless sound again, full of emotion and meaning. Then she reached for her slate and wrote, "I love you too." But as she showed him the slate, something miraculous happened. Grace made a sound. Not a wordless vocalization, but an actual sound that formed a word. It was rough, barely above a whisper, strained and imperfect, but unmistakable. Thomas. His name. She had said his name. Thomas stared at her in shock. "Grace, did you just—" Grace's eyes were wide with her own surprise. Her hand went to her throat, feeling the vibration of her vocal cords. She opened her mouth and tried again. "Thomas," she whispered, the word a little clearer this time. "How?" Thomas asked, his voice breaking. "I thought you could not speak." Grace reached for her slate with shaking hands and wrote quickly. "The doctor said the damage might heal over time, but it has been so many years. I stopped hoping. I thought it was impossible." She paused, then tried again to speak. "Love," she whispered. "I love you." The words were rough and quiet, her voice rusty from years of disuse, but they were words. Real spoken words. Thomas pulled her into his arms, overwhelmed with emotion. "Say it again," he whispered. "Please." "I love you," Grace said, her voice growing marginally stronger with each word. "Thomas, I love you." They held each other on that porch, both crying now as the impossible became reality. Grace tried more words, testing the limits of her returning voice. Some words came easier than others. Her voice was hoarse and weak, like someone recovering from a long illness, but it was there. "Why now?" Thomas asked when they finally went inside. "Why would your voice suddenly return now?" Grace wrote on her slate, still finding it easier than speaking. "I do not know. Maybe the doctor was right and it just took time. Maybe." She paused, then wrote more. "Maybe I needed a reason to speak. Maybe I needed something worth saying." Over the following weeks, Grace worked to strengthen her voice. At first, she could only manage a few words at a time before her throat became too strained. But gradually, with practice, she could speak more and for longer periods. Her voice remained soft and a bit rough, never quite losing the husky quality of someone recovering from a long silence, but it was hers. Thomas marveled at every word she spoke. The sound of her voice reading aloud from a book as they lay in bed at night became his favorite sound in the world. She had a slight accent, a musical quality to her words that reflected her Spanish heritage and the way she had learned English primarily through reading. "I never imagined this," Grace said one evening as they prepared supper together. Speaking was still effortful, so she chose her words carefully. "I accepted that I would be silent forever. Now everything has changed." "Everything changed when I met you," Thomas said, kissing her forehead. "This is just one more miracle in a series of them." Grace smiled and continued chopping vegetables. She still used her slate sometimes, particularly when her throat was tired, but the slate was no longer her only means of communication. In late August, Grace began to feel unwell. She was tired all the time and nauseated in the mornings. At first, she attributed it to the summer heat and hard work, but when the symptoms persisted, a different possibility occurred to her. She rode into Abilene alone one morning while Thomas was out with the herd. She visited the widow Ortiz and asked her aunt to bring the town's midwife. The midwife, a practical woman named Mrs. Henley, examined Grace and confirmed what she had suspected. She was with child. "About 3 months along, I would say," Mrs. Henley said. "You should be feeling better soon as the morning sickness passes. Make sure you are eating well and getting rest." Grace rode back to the ranch in a daze of joy and fear. A baby. She and Thomas were going to have a baby. Part of her was thrilled at the prospect, but another part worried. What if something went wrong? What if she could not manage a child and the ranch work both? That evening she waited until after supper to tell Thomas. They were sitting on the porch, as had become their habit, watching the sun set. Grace's heart was pounding as she prepared to share her news. "Thomas," she said softly, still getting used to the sound of her own voice speaking his name. "I have something to tell you." He turned to look at her, concern flickering across his face. "What is it?" "Are you all right?" "I am fine," Grace assured him. "More than fine. I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Thomas just stared at her, the words not quite registering. Then his face broke into the widest smile Grace had ever seen. "A baby! We are going to have a baby," Grace nodded, tears springing to her eyes. "In the spring. Late February or early March, the midwife thinks." Thomas let out a whoop of joy and picked Grace up, spinning her around before remembering her condition and setting her down gently. "A baby," he kept repeating. "We are going to have a baby." He placed his hand on her stomach, which was still flat, showing no outward sign of the life growing within. "I love you," he said fiercely. "Both of you." "I love you too," Grace whispered. The news of the baby energized Thomas. He threw himself into preparing for the child's arrival, even though they had months yet to wait. He built a cradle from oak wood, sanding it until it was perfectly smooth. He repaired the house more thoroughly, making sure every crack was sealed and every board secure. He even built a small addition onto the house, creating a second bedroom that could serve as a nursery. Grace continued to work, but took care not to overdo it. Her morning sickness faded as Mrs. Henley had predicted, replaced by a seemingly endless appetite and a growing roundness to her belly. She sewed baby clothes from scraps of fabric, tiny gowns and blankets that seemed impossibly small. Neighbors stopped by more frequently now, bringing gifts for the coming baby and advice for the new parents. The frontier community, for all its hardships, took care of its own. Several women promised to be available when Grace's time came, ready to assist with the birth. As fall turned to winter, Grace's belly grew large and round. Thomas was constantly concerned about her, wanting her to rest more, to do less. Grace found his worry both endearing and frustrating. "I am pregnant, not ill," she reminded him one evening, her voice stronger now, though still soft. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am fine." "I know," Thomas said, running his hand through his hair, "but I cannot help worrying. You are everything to me. You and this baby." Grace took his hand and placed it on her swollen belly. "Feel that. The baby is strong. I am strong. We will both be fine." As if to prove her point, the baby kicked hard against Thomas's palm. His eyes widened with wonder. "I felt that. The baby kicked," Grace laughed. "The baby kicks all the time now, especially at night when I am trying to sleep." They spent that evening with Thomas's hand on Grace's belly, feeling their child move and kick. Thomas talked to the baby, telling it about the ranch, about the life they would have together. Grace watched him with love shining in her eyes. Christmas came, and Grace and Thomas celebrated their first holiday as a family. Thomas cut a small pine tree, and Grace decorated it with strings of popcorn and paper ornaments. They exchanged simple gifts. Grace had knitted Thomas a warm scarf, and Thomas had carved Grace a beautiful wooden box for her to keep her journal and special things in. "This is the best Christmas I have ever had," Thomas said as they sat by the fire. Grace nestled in his arms. "Mine too," Grace agreed, "because I am spending it with you." On New Year's Day of 1879, they stood together on the porch and looked out over their land. The ranch was still modest, but it was prospering. They had 40 head of cattle now, 4 horses, a growing chicken flock, and money in the bank. More importantly, they had each other and a baby on the way. "What do you think this year will bring?" Grace asked. "Everything," Thomas said simply. "Everything we have been working toward. A child. A home. A future." Grace squeezed his hand. "I am glad I answered your telegram, glad I took the chance." "I am glad you did too," Thomas said. "You saved me, Grace. In every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Grace corrected gently. February arrived with bitter cold and heavy snow. Grace was enormous now, her belly so large she could barely see her own feet. She moved slowly, uncomfortable in her body, eager for the pregnancy to be over. The baby came on a stormy night in late February. Grace's labor started just after sunset, mild contractions that gradually grew stronger and closer together. Thomas rode through the snow to fetch Mrs. Henley and 2 other women who had promised to help. The labor was long and difficult. Grace suffered through the night and into the next day, her voice growing hoarse from crying out with pain. Thomas stayed by her side, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, feeling utterly helpless. "You are doing so well," he kept telling her. "So strong. I love you so much." Finally, as the sun began to set on the second day, the baby arrived with a lusty cry. Mrs. Henley cleaned the infant and wrapped it in a blanket. "You have a son," she announced, placing the baby in Grace's arms. Grace looked down at her child, tears streaming down her face. The baby was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn brown like hers. He was screaming his displeasure at being born, his tiny fists waving. "A son," Grace whispered. "Thomas, we have a son." Thomas looked at his wife and child, and something in his chest seemed to crack open. Love flooded through him, so intense it was almost painful. "He is perfect," he managed to say. "You are perfect. I love you both so much." They named him Daniel after Thomas's father. Daniel Lawson, born February 22, 1879, on a small ranch in Kansas to parents who loved him more than anything in the world. The weeks after Daniel's birth were exhausting but joyful. The baby was healthy and loud, demanding to be fed every few hours. Grace was tired but happy. recovering from the birth while adjusting to motherhood. Thomas helped as much as he could, changing Daniel's nappies, walking him when he cried at night, doing extra chores so Grace could rest. "I never knew I could be this tired and this happy at the same time," Grace said one night as she nursed Daniel. Thomas smiled, watching his wife and son. "He is worth it." "He is," Grace agreed. "Every sleepless night, every moment of worry, he is worth it all." As spring arrived and the prairie came back to life, so did their household. Grace regained her strength, and Daniel began to grow and change, his eyes turning the same dark brown as his mother's, his personality starting to emerge. He was a happy baby, quick to smile, curious about everything around him. Thomas would take Daniel out to the barn, holding him carefully as he showed him the horses and told him about the cattle. "This will all be yours someday," he would say. "Your legacy." Grace would watch from the doorway, her heart full. This life they had built together, this family, it was more than she had ever dreamed possible when she stepped off that train over a year ago. One evening in May, as they celebrated Daniel's 3-month milestone, Thomas pulled Grace close and kissed her. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" Grace asked. "For saying yes," Thomas said. "For taking a chance on a poor rancher you had never met. For building this life with me, for our son. For everything." Grace touched his face gently. "I would do it all again," she said. "Every single moment. You gave me a home, Thomas. You gave me love. You gave me a reason to speak again. You gave me everything that matters." They stood together on their porch, their son sleeping peacefully in his cradle inside, and watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The prairie stretched out before them, vast and beautiful and full of promise. "What should we name the next one?" Thomas asked, a teasing note in his voice. Grace laughed. "Give me some time to recover from this one first." "Fair enough," Thomas said, pulling her closer. "We have all the time in the world." The ranch continued to prosper over the following years. Thomas and Grace worked hard, reinvesting their profits into expanding the herd and improving the property. They added a room onto the house, then another. They bought more land, more cattle, more horses. Daniel grew into a bright, energetic boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's determined chin. He learned to walk and talk, his voice filling the house with chatter and questions. He followed Thomas everywhere, wanting to help with every chore, learning the ways of the ranch. When Daniel was 2 years old, Grace became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and she delivered a healthy daughter in the fall of 1881. They named her Margaret, after Thomas's mother. Margaret was quieter than Daniel had been, a calm baby who watched the world with solemn eyes. 2 children, Thomas marveled, holding Margaret while Daniel played at his feet. "We are truly blessed." "We are," Grace agreed. "More than I ever imagined we could be." The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and work and love. Another child came in 1883, a second son they named Peter. The house was full now, full of children and laughter and life. Grace's voice grew stronger with use, though it never lost its soft, husky quality. She no longer needed her slate at all except occasionally to make lists. She could shout for the children when they wandered too far, sing lullabies at bedtime, tell stories by the fire. Sometimes she would think back to that day at the train station when she had stepped off the train to marry a stranger. She thought about how scared she had been, how uncertain. She thought about the woman she had been then, silent, desperate, alone. She was not that woman anymore. She was Grace Lawson, wife and mother, rancher and partner. She was loved and needed and valued. She had found her voice in more ways than one. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Grace into Abilene for dinner at the hotel restaurant, leaving the children with the widow Ortiz. It was a rare evening alone together, and they savored every moment. 5 years, Thomas said, raising his glass of wine. It feels like both a lifetime and no time at all. I know what you mean, Grace said, her voice warm. I cannot remember what my life was like before you. I do not want to remember. We have built something good here, Thomas said. Something worth fighting for, worth protecting. We have, Grace agreed, and we will keep building it for our children and their children after them. They returned home late that night to find all 3 children asleep and the widow Ortiz dozing in a chair. They sent her home with thanks and checked on their sleeping children, tucking blankets around them and kissing their foreheads. In their own bedroom, Thomas pulled Grace close. I love you, he said, more now than on our wedding day, if that is possible. It is possible, Grace said, because I love you more now too. Love grows, Thomas. It deepens and strengthens with time. They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity, and afterward lay wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the sounds of their home, the creak of settling boards, the soft breathing of children, the distant call of an owl. You ever regret it? Thomas asked quietly. Agreeing to marry me, coming here? Never, Grace said firmly. Not for a single moment. This is exactly where I was meant to be. The years continued to roll forward, bringing both challenges and triumphs. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken fences, injuries and setbacks. But there were also good harvests and healthy calves, children's birthdays and holidays, quiet evenings and passionate nights. When Daniel turned 10 in 1889, Thomas began teaching him the business side of ranching, how to negotiate prices, how to manage accounts, how to plan for the future. Daniel soaked it all up, already dreaming of the day when the ranch would be his. Margaret, at 8, showed a talent for healing. She was always nursing injured animals back to health, setting broken wings on birds and splinting rabbit legs. She should be a doctor, Grace said, watching her daughter tend to a wounded calf. A female doctor, Thomas asked doubtfully. Is that even possible? Maybe not yet, Grace said. But the world is changing. Who knows what will be possible when she is grown? 6-year-old Peter was the dreamer of the family, always wandering off to explore, coming back with pockets full of interesting rocks and tall tales about what he had seen. He will see the world someday, Thomas predicted. He has the soul of a wanderer. Maybe, Grace said, but he will always come home. This place gets into your blood. She was right. The ranch was more than just land and cattle. It was home in the deepest sense, the place where they had built their life together, where they had learned to love each other, where they had raised their family. In 1891, the widow Ortiz passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 73. Grace mourned the woman who had been both aunt and mother to her, who had given her the chance at a new life. They buried her in the town cemetery, and Grace spoke at the service, her strong voice carrying across the gathered mourners. She gave me everything, Grace said. When I had nothing, when I was no one, she saw my worth. She believed in me, and because she believed in me, I was able to find my place in this world. I will be grateful to her for the rest of my life. Thomas held Grace's hand throughout the service and afterward, as she cried against his chest. She knew you were happy, he told her. She saw what we built together. That gave her peace. I know, Grace said, but I will miss her terribly. Time continued its relentless march. The children grew, the ranch prospered, Thomas and Grace grew older together. They added silver to their hair and lines to their faces, but their love only deepened. On a warm evening in late May of 1893, 15 years after they had married, Thomas and Grace sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. Daniel was in town courting a girl, Margaret was reading by lamplight inside, and Peter was asleep after a long day of helping with the horses. 15 years, Grace said, leaning against Thomas. Where has the time gone? I do not know, Thomas admitted. But I would not change a single moment of it. Not even the hard parts, Grace asked. The droughts and storms and struggles, especially not the hard parts, Thomas said. Those made us stronger, made us appreciate the good times more. Grace was quiet for a moment, then said, Do you remember our wedding night, when I finally spoke? How could I forget? Thomas said. It was a miracle. I had been trying for weeks, Grace confessed. Ever since I realized I was falling in love with you. I wanted to tell you, but I could not make the words come. That night when you gave me the music box, when you kissed me for the first time, the words just came out, like my heart finally found a way to express what I was feeling. Your love healed you, Thomas said softly. Our love healed us both, Grace corrected. You were as broken as I was when we met, Thomas. Your parents were gone, you were losing the ranch, you were alone. We saved each other. Thomas kissed her forehead. We did, and we will keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives. They sat together as the stars emerged and the prairie came alive with night sounds. Inside the house, they could hear Margaret turning pages and Peter talking in his sleep. Soon Daniel would come home, full of stories about his evening. This was their life. Simple, hard-working, full of love. It was everything they had hoped for and more. The poor rancher and the mute woman who had married for survival had found something neither had been looking for, a love that would last a lifetime. I love you, Grace said, the words as easy now as breathing. I love you too, Thomas replied. Always and forever. They remained there as the moon rose, two people who had taken a chance on each other and won everything that mattered. The prairie wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of grass and earth and home, and they were content. The years that followed continued to shape their family's story. Daniel married his sweetheart, Anna, in 1895, a lovely girl from a neighboring ranch. They held the wedding at the Lawson Ranch, with half the county in attendance. Grace cried happy tears as she watched her oldest son pledge his life to another, remembering her own wedding day so many years ago. He looks so much like you, Grace whispered to Thomas as they watched Daniel and Anna dance. He has your strength, though, Thomas replied. All our children do. Daniel and Anna built a small house on the northern edge of the Lawson property, and Daniel took on more responsibility in running the ranch. Thomas was in his 40s now, his body showing the wear of decades of hard work. He was grateful to have his son's strong back and sharp mind to help carry the load. Margaret, true to her calling, began studying medicine through correspondence courses. In 1896, she left for medical school in Boston, one of only a handful of women accepted to the program. Grace was both proud and heartbroken to see her daughter leave. She will come back, Thomas assured her. This is her home. She will always come back. I know, Grace said, but I will miss her every day she is gone. They received letters from Margaret regularly, full of stories about her studies and the exciting, terrifying world of modern medicine. She wrote about electric lights and telephones, about new surgical techniques and medical discoveries. The world was changing rapidly, leaving the quiet prairie life behind. Peter, predictably, became restless as he entered his late teens. In 1897, at 17, he announced his intention to join the army. The Spanish-American War was brewing, and Peter wanted to serve his country. Thomas was torn. He was proud of his son's courage but terrified of losing him. War is not an adventure, he told Peter. Men die. Good men, young men. I know, Pa, Peter said, but I need to do this. I need to see what else is out there. Grace held her youngest son tight the day he left. Come home to us, she whispered. Promise me you will come home. I promise, Ma, Peter said. "This is my home. I will always come home." The house felt empty with Peter gone and Margaret away at school. Grace threw herself into helping Daniel and Anna, who were expecting their first child. She sewed baby clothes and offered advice, remembering her own anxiety before Daniel's birth. In December of 1897, Anna gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Thomas, after his grandfather. Thomas Lawson Sr. held his grandson and namesake with tears streaming down his weathered face. "A grandfather," he said in wonder. "I am a grandfather." "And I am a grandmother," Grace said, laughing through her own tears. "How did we get so old?" But age had not diminished their love for each other. If anything, it had strengthened it. They were partners in the truest sense, bound by years of shared work, shared joy, shared sorrow. They knew each other's thoughts, finished each other's sentences, moved in harmony born of long practice. On quiet evenings, Thomas would still wind up the music box he had given Grace all those years ago. The mechanism was showing its age, the tune slightly warped, but to them it was still beautiful. They would lie in bed, listening to the familiar melody, hands intertwined. "Do you remember when I first gave this to you?" Thomas asked one night. "Of course," Grace said. "It was the first time you kissed me, the first time I told you I loved you. The first time you spoke," Thomas added. "I still remember how shocked I was, how miraculous it seemed." "It was miraculous," Grace said. "Everything about us was miraculous. We should not have worked, Thomas. A marriage of convenience between strangers, but we did work. We worked beautifully." "Because we chose to make it work," Thomas said. "Every day we chose each other." "And I would choose you again," Grace said. 1,000 times over I would choose you." Margaret returned home in 1899, having completed her medical training. She was 22 years old, a fully licensed physician, and bursting with ideas about how to bring modern medicine to rural Kansas. She set up a practice in Abilene, treating everyone from ranch hands to town merchants, slowly earning the respect of those who were skeptical about a female doctor. Grace was intensely proud of her daughter. "You did what I never could," she told Margaret. "You made people hear you, even when they did not want to listen." "I learned that from you, Ma," Margaret said. "You taught me that being silent and being unheard are two different things. You were never truly silent. People just were not listening hard enough." Peter returned from the war in 1900, thinner and quieter but alive and whole. He had seen things he would not talk about, done things that haunted him. But he was home, and slowly, surrounded by family and familiar work, he began to heal. "The ranch is in your blood," Thomas told him. "It will anchor you, ground you," Peter nodded. "I needed to leave to appreciate it," he said. "To understand what we have here, I will never leave again." The new century brought changes both welcome and challenging. Automobiles began appearing on the roads, though most ranchers still relied on horses. Telephones connected towns that had once been isolated. The world was shrinking, speeding up, modernizing, but some things remained constant. The prairie still stretched endlessly under vast skies. Cattle still needed tending. Land still needed working. Families still gathered around dinner tables, still celebrated births and mourned deaths, still loved and fought and forgave. Thomas and Grace celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in 1903. Daniel and Anna threw them a party, inviting friends and neighbors from all over the county. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and endless stories about the couple who had started with nothing and built an empire of love. 25 years, Thomas said in his speech, his arm around Grace. A quarter-century with this remarkable woman. She came to me as a stranger, unable to speak, and she gave me everything. She gave me her strength, her heart, her voice. She gave me children and grandchildren. She gave me a reason to keep fighting when times were hard. She gave me love beyond measure. I am the luckiest man alive." Grace stood and spoke, her voice still soft but clear. "Thomas saved my life," she said simply. "I was lost when I came here, desperate and alone. He gave me a home, a purpose, a family. He treated me as an equal when others saw only my limitations. He loved me when I did not believe I was worthy of love. Everything good in my life comes from the day I stepped off that train and into his life. I love you, Thomas Lawson. Today, tomorrow, forever." There was not a dry eye in the house. As they danced together that night, Grace in her best dress and Thomas in a new suit, they might have been young again, two people discovering each other for the first time. But they were better than young. They were seasoned, tested, proven. Their love had survived everything life could throw at it and emerged stronger. The years continued their march. Daniel took over full management of the ranch as Thomas's health began to decline. Grace remained spry and active, refusing to slow down despite Thomas's protests. They became the patriarch and matriarch of a growing family. 4 grandchildren by 1905, with more expected. Margaret married another doctor in 1906, a kind man named Robert who appreciated his wife's skills and intelligence. They settled in Abilene, and Margaret continued her practice. Peter married a teacher from town in 1907, a practical woman named Sarah who loved the ranch as much as he did. Thomas and Grace watched their children build their own lives, their own families, their own legacies. It was deeply satisfying to see how well their children had turned out, how happy they were. "We did good," Thomas said one evening as they watched Daniel teaching young Thomas to rope a fence post. "We did," Grace agreed. "Our children are good people, kind, strong, capable. They will take care of this land and each other long after we are gone." "No talk of leaving yet," Thomas said, squeezing her hand. "We have years ahead of us still, but time is cruel and indiscriminate." In the winter of 1908, Thomas caught pneumonia. Despite Margaret's best efforts and Grace's constant care, he did not recover. He died on a cold February morning with Grace holding his hand and all 3 of their children at his bedside. "I love you," were his last words, spoken directly to Grace. "Always and forever." "Always and forever," Grace whispered back, tears streaming down her face. They buried Thomas on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple stone marker bearing his name and dates. The funeral was enormous, with people coming from all over Kansas to pay their respects to a man who had been respected and loved by all who knew him. Grace was devastated by the loss. After 30 years of marriage, she felt like half of herself had been torn away. The house echoed with Thomas's absence. The bed was too big, the evenings too quiet. She moved through her days mechanically, doing what needed to be done but finding no joy in it. Her children worried about her. They took turns staying at the ranch, making sure she ate, trying to draw her out of her grief. But Grace was lost in memories, in longing for what was gone. One evening, Margaret found her mother in the bedroom, holding the old music box. "Ma," she said softly. "He gave this to me on the day I knew I loved him," Grace said, her voice thick with tears. "The day I first spoke, the day everything changed." "Tell me about it," Margaret said, sitting beside her mother. "Tell me the whole story." So Grace did. She told her daughter about arriving in Abilene as a desperate woman with no voice and no hope. About meeting Thomas at the train station, about the awkward beginning of their marriage, about learning to trust each other. She told Margaret about the storm that brought them together, about the music box and the first kiss, about the moment when love gave her back her voice. "It was not a fairy tale," Grace said. "It was hard work and determination and choosing each other every single day, but it was also magic. Real, lasting magic." "That is the kind of love I want," Margaret said. "The kind you and Pa had." "Then you must be brave," Grace told her daughter. "Love requires courage. It requires vulnerability. It requires showing up every day, even when things are hard. Your father and I, we were not perfect. We argued, we struggled, we had hard times, but we never gave up on each other. That was our secret." Over the following months, Grace slowly emerged from her grief. She would never stop missing Thomas, would never stop loving him, but she learned to live with his absence. She found purpose in her grandchildren, in helping Daniel run the ranch, in the community that had embraced her all those years ago. She often visited Thomas's grave, sitting beside the stone marker and talking to him as if he could hear. She told him about the grandchildren, about the ranch, about her days. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she laughed, remembering funny moments they had shared. "I will be with you soon enough," she would say, "but I am not ready yet. There is still work to be done here." Grace lived for another 10 years after Thomas's death, watching her grandchildren grow, welcoming more great-grandchildren. She became a legend in the community. The woman who could not speak, who found her voice, who built an empire with her husband from nothing, who embodied strength and grace. On a warm spring evening in 1918, Grace sat on her porch watching the sunset. She was 70 years old and her body was finally beginning to fail, but her mind was sharp, her memories clear. Margaret was with her, having come to check on her mother. "How are you feeling, Ma?" she asked. "Tired," Grace admitted, "but content. I have lived a good life, Margaret, a full life. I have no regrets." "What was the best part?" Margaret asked. "Of all of it, what was the best part?" Grace smiled. "Loving your father," she said without hesitation. "Being loved by him. Everything else, all the joy and success and family, it all flowed from that. Love was the foundation everything was built on." That night, Grace went to bed feeling peaceful. She wound the old music box one last time, listening to its familiar tune. She closed her eyes, and in her dreams she saw Thomas waiting for her, young and strong, with that smile she had fallen in love with. "There you are," he said, holding out his hand. "I have been waiting for you." "I am here," Grace said, taking his hand. "Always and forever." Grace died peacefully in her sleep that night. They buried her next to Thomas on the hill overlooking the ranch, their stones side by side, together even in death. The Lawson Ranch continued to prosper under Daniel's management and later under his son's management. The family grew and expanded, generation after generation. But they never forgot the story of Thomas and Grace, the poor rancher and the woman who could not speak, who had built it all from nothing. Their great-great-grandchildren still visit those two graves on the hill, still listen to the story of how a marriage of convenience became one of the great love stories of the Kansas prairie. The music box, carefully preserved, sits in a place of honor in the ranch house, a symbol of the moment when love conquered silence. And if you stand on that hill at sunset, when the prairie wind whispers through the grass, some say you can still hear it, the soft melody of an old music box, and the sound of two people who loved each other beyond death, beyond time, beyond all obstacles. Their love story ended happily, not because their lives were without struggle or sorrow, but because they faced everything together, hand in hand, heart to heart. They chose each other every day, and that choice transformed them both. Thomas and Grace Lawson proved that love does not need the perfect beginning. It needs the perfect commitment. To show up, to work hard, to be patient, to be kind, to forgive, to grow together. They proved that sometimes the most practical arrangement can become the most profound romance. Their legacy was not just the successful ranch or the large family they created. Their legacy was the example they set. That love is a choice, made daily, that transforms everything it touches. They showed that even the broken can be healed, that the voiceless can find their song, and that two strangers can become soulmates if they are brave enough to try. The prairie remembers them still. The land they worked, the house they built, the family they raised. It remembers a love that began in desperation and ended in triumph, a love that spoke volumes even in silence, a love that proved forever is not just possible but worth fighting for. And in the end, that is the only story that matters. Two people who found each other in the wilderness and built paradise together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of love at a time.